Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. In our last episode, we had Mal at a crossroads in his career and life. He was asked to work full-time as a roadie for the Beatles. After some sleepless nights, he decided to follow his dream and join them. So let's see what's going on today. July 31st, 1963, 28-year-old Mal Evans told GPO that he was quitting. A few days later, he signed the Official Secrets Act declaration, affirming under threat of prosecution that when it came to many sensitive information or material he had encountered during his employment, he would maintain his discretion in perpetuity. On Sunday, August 11th, Mal took a 40-minute drive from Moseley Hill to Manchester Airport, where the Beatles were set to arrive after fulfilling a quartet of gigs on Jersey and the Channel Islands. Mal wanted not only to excel in his new role, but to honor Lily, who, despite her misgivings, never once stood in my way, knowing that I always had been yearning to be in show business, to be an entertainer, and road manager for the Beatles was, for me, the next best thing. Well, Mal at this time was nervous, waiting for his new employers to arrive. Then suddenly all the Beatles were there, and Mal said all my fears were dispelled when the four of them greeted me with smiles, saying, "Nice to have you with us." Not long afterwards, Pete Best learned the news that Mal had joined the entourage on a full-time basis. Pete was still upset about being fired from the Beatles, but he was happy for Mal. He said it couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. The Beatles understood how Mal felt. They had to deal with friends and relations, parents, girlfriends, about how crazy it was taking a risk on a rock and roll group. For Mal, it was a decision that came with an even greater risk, with Lily and Gary's well-being hanging in the balance. Brian's gamble had come closest to Mal's. At his first gig as road manager, an evening show at Blackpool's ABC Theatre, Mal wore a suit at Brian's direction, with the expenses deducted from his wages. On that day, he realized that part-time bouncing and serving as a Beatles full-time roadie were very different things. The Cavern was already in the band's rearview mirror. After joining Neil and the Beatles in Manchester, Mal didn't get to bed until 3:30 a.m., and they had to have a wake-up call at 9:45 a.m. Neil was afraid of being cut loose for incompetence. Being on call both day and night was one of the band's unstated requirements. Mal said, "I was still green at the job of roadie, and the Beatles have been very tolerant with the mistakes I made while settling in and learning my new trade. Mind you, in the first week I worked with them, I was to be fired about 7 times, as first one thing, then the other went wrong. First up was the issue of getting Ringo's drum set, which Mal had never seen up close, and before Mal said that Neil had helped him for the first couple of days, but the first time I was on my own, I was terrible," he wrote. In desperation, he asked another band's drummer to help out, only to belatedly realize each drummer likes his cymbals at a special height. And one time, when Mal was getting used to his new job, Ringo's cymbals slid down to the stage, and while another time his bass drum simply toppled over mid-performance. When it happened, Mal stood in the wings as the mishaps mounted up, wondering if he'd been put in his last nights as the Beatles roadie. Paul asked Mal what he'd do if they actually fired him, and Mal said, "I'd cry, Paul. I'd just cry," he replied. Mal finally learned how to properly set up and take down Ringo's drum kit from a 23-year-old Derek Hughes, the roadie for Billy J. Kramer and the Dakotas. Derek said he hadn't the vaguest idea about setting up the drum kit. "I spent the next 2 days building the drum kit up and stripping it down, building it up and stripping it down, and showing him how to do it." The Beatles' brief time in Wales was pressure for Mal. The Beatles' Twist and Shout had earned a Silver Disc Award for notching top sales of more than 250,000 copies, and the cinema was packed to the gills. Neil was relieved that the Beatles' operation was finally catching up with that for Jerry and the Pacemakers, and that there was finally a proper distribution of duties. Mal started driving the van and looking after all the equipment and stage clothes. Aspinall said he would look after the Beatles and the press and the other people in our lives. And Cynthia Lennon, who had been married to John since 1962, remembered things differently. She said the plan was for Mal to handle all the transporting of their equipment, the setting up and dismantling at concerts, while Neil looked after their personal needs for transport, food, and so on. At least that was the theory, but in practice, she added, they both did anything and everything that needed doing, from getting the Beatles safely onto a plane to finding sandwiches when they felt peckish. Life on the road with the Beatles was complicated. Because the boys didn't like to be handled, that caused Mal and Neil to walk a thin line. Neil said they would hang up their own clothes, do their own personal packing, shine their own shoes and such. They would much rather do it themselves than have someone hovering over them, waiting on them. Neil expected Mal to drive the van, but keep a steady pace. And Mal wasn't the type to be in a hurry, and he followed the speed limit. Neil took issue, saying, "Come on, Mal, put your foot down. We got a show to get to." Mal listened, and by late August he had earned a warning for a busted taillight. And on August 29th, he received his first speeding ticket in the Beatles' employ. Neil and the Beatles were very impressed with Mal's ability to lift the heavy amps, especially Paul's notorious coffin, all by his lonesome. It was at this time that Mal got in trouble with Lily. During his first 2 weeks on the road, he didn't phone home to his wife. By the time he got back home on August 25th, she was mad. Lily had been the one to support his decision to join the Beatles team, and then her reward was neglect. When Mal got home, Lily took Gary, and she went to stay at the home of Mal's sister Barbara and her husband Eric Hull. She stayed away 5 days while Mal was at the house, and when she went back on August 30th, she made a truce with her husband on the condition that from that point forward he would write or call home every day. Mal started to write regularly to Lily while he was gone, and even sent postcards to his parents from places near and wide. Mal knew that he had done wrong, but he also knew that he adored the freedom of his new life. He enjoyed it when Neil and the boys traveled separately, and he was alone in the van, transporting the Beatles' equipment on the open road. It made him feel like a free man. The Southport residency marked the final shows in which Neil assisted Mal in setting up the equipment. The issues always involved Ringo's drums. Mal said, "I well remember the first night I was to be left on my own, with all of what seemed a million parts spread about the theater stage. Neil had let people help him, but I wouldn't. I wanted to do it all by myself for several reasons. One being I knew exactly where I was up to at any time, the other because I was possessive of the Beatles and didn't want to share them with anyone. But it was more than that. One disastrous occasion, Mal had learned his lesson about working alone after accepting assistance from a local stagehand. By this time, Mal could strip down and pack up the drum kit in 2 minutes flat. Not wanting to reject the stagehand's kind offer, he asked the man to disassemble Ringo's drums for transport. Unfortunately, the stagehand took Mal's instructions too precisely. Mal said, "I turned around to be greeted with a pile of individual nuts and bolts and pieces of drum kit stacked all over the stage. The guy had literally taken it apart. After that, I really was on my own." Neil was tending directly to the Beatles' needs and assuming a more administrative role, just as he and Brian had originally planned. Mal developed a steady routine for handling the equipment responsibilities. On a typical show day, he would unload the gear at 3 p.m., and that gave him plenty of time to set up and test out the guitars, amps, and drums. Later, the Beatles would arrive, and Mal would join them for tea and sandwiches. The last half hour before the show was taken up with getting stage suits ready, polishing boots. Mal wrote, "For one thing for sure, I was very proud of my boys and wanted them to look their best, so no job was too menial to further the same." In between shows, Neil and I would arrange for meals to be brought in, or I would go out and collect them. During this period, hanging shirts in boiler rooms to dry, for the Beatles always put their heart and souls into a show and came off stage soaked with perspiration. During the last night at Southport, Lily was to see one of the earliest live performances of She Loves You, a new song in the Beatles' repertoire. Released as a single August 23rd, the record racked up a phenomenal 500,000 advance orders. Things would start changing in the Beatles world. Mal caught wind of the fans checking into the Beatles hotel on the chance that they might get to meet their idols. By the time the Beatles and their entourage made their way to Southport, Mal found himself walking in the gauntlet of the growing and increasingly hysterical hordes of fans who congregated prior to each show. For this reason, managing the Beatles shows was becoming ever more difficult for local police forces as summer transitioned into fall. Mal found out problems developed after the Beatles' performances when the police often abandoned their post after Neil had got the bandmates inside their lodgings. But because the Beatles dropped their guitars and were on the road before the last chords had reached the balcony, Mal said the audience would not believe they had left the building, hanging around hours afterwards, making loading the van hazardous at times. Mal came up with a system for bringing a gig to a close under such dire conditions. He said I would carry one piece out, unlock the van, stow it in, lock the van, and it would take quite a long period of time. That sounds like what Neil was doing before, but let's continue. During this, I would be pushed and pulled, having the feeling that I was defending the band's equipment with my very life, ending up with my clothes covered in lipstick, for the fans had lovingly scrawled, "I love you, Paul, George, John, and Ringo," all over the van. George later pointed out that the Ford van had increasingly become a liability. It was the center of attention every time it pulled up. It was brush painted in red and gray, and from head to foot was covered in graffiti. The van also presented an ongoing security problem because if anything was going to get nicked, it was obvious where it was kept. That September, the monthly fanzine, The Beatles Book, published an official welcome message from Mal, capturing both the necessity of his new role and the scope of the Beatles' fame at the juncture. The Beatles have a permanent new roadie to complement the overworked but still cheerful Neil Aspinall. He's Mal Evans, who had taken over much of the responsibility for getting the Beatles and their instruments to the right place at the right time. Despite a run of #1 singles, the boys are still a long way from Rolls Royces and chauffeur-driven limousines. Then we have Mal and the Beatles arriving at 3 Abbey Road, the home of the EMI recording studios. The front of the building was white-painted Georgian-era townhouse and Tony St. John's wood. The complex opened November 1931. It consisted of 3 studios constructed behind the original estate, which served as an administrative quarters. The largest facility, Studio 1, could accommodate a full orchestra and chorus, with Studio 2 and 3 providing progressively smaller creative spaces. Mal made his first visit there on Wednesday, September 11th. The Beatles were working with producer George Martin to put the finishing touches on their second LP with the Beatles. The band hadn't been to the studio since July 30th, shortly after Mal and Lily returned from their holiday when he had made his life-changing decision to join the Beatles full-time. Now, nearly a month later, Mal was sitting in Studio 2 when a small mouse crept out of the shadows and started playing around his shoes, observing the Beatles record 5 new songs. The next day, Mal listened in as the Beatles recorded messages for Australian DJs in advance of a planned 1964 Oceanic tour. Brian had struck the deal with Australian promoters back in July, and Mal was pleased. He had recently applied for and received his first passport, which listed his occupation as road manager, just in time for the Beatles' upcoming October 1963 Swedish tour. Mal had fantasized about Scandinavian beauties and a progressive free love movement that was rumored to be launching Northern Europe into an uninhibited sexual frenzy. He simply couldn't wait. In the meantime, he was expected back in Bournemouth for the next installment of his military training. Mal missed the morning train out of Liverpool. He had ferried the Beatles in the Ford van on their return trip from London. With Mal behind the wheel, they made the drive in just under 5 hours, including a stopover for a quick meal at the Blue Boar Inn, one of Mal's favorite haunts on the M5. Then he caught a later train and he finally joined the other first-year territorials in Bournemouth. Mal lost his excitement for the soldiering life. The redemption he was after when he was rejected by the medical board in 1953 had dissipated. As the ensuing months mounted up, Mal ignored the emergency reserve's recurring reminders about his service commitment. Eventually, he was quietly discharged by the territorials, having completed a grand total of 3 training sessions. The next day, Mal left the reserve, catching the first train to London. The Beatles were headlining the Great Pop Prom, a benefit event for the Printers' Pension Corporation held at Royal Albert Hall. The Beatles were supported by up-and-comers, the Rolling Stones, and they rocked the house to its foundations. Mal wouldn't have missed it for the world. So Mal was super busy with the Beatles, but he managed to build in regular visits with Lily and Gary, and he showered his adoring wife with love letters when he couldn't be in Liverpool in person. On September 12th, She Loves You vaulted to the top of the UK charts, setting sale records in the process, and created the conditions for one of the most remarkable moments in the history of the British Isles. And Mal would be in the center of the whirlwind. In October 1963, the Beatles would be on television. With the success of She Loves You and the Great Pop from Prom having added to their luster, the Beatles were to appear on the October 13th installment of Val Parnell's popular variety show, Sunday Night at the London Palladium. The Beatles rehearsed and rehearsed at the Donner Theatre before the show was to be aired. They wanted to take advantage, knowing it was going to give them national exposure. Mal checked and rechecked the equipment before the evening's broadcast, while the staff at the London Palladium bent over backwards to give Mal all the help he needed. At one point, Mal and Neil took a break to pick up sodas and hot dogs for the Beatles and their entourage from a Carnaby Street cafe. At the beginning of the day, a few hundred fans had begun to gather outside the Palladium. By the time Mal and Neil returned to the theater with food, the crowd had swelled considerably. The fans mistook the roadies for the Beatles themselves, and the pre-show excitement reached a fever pitch. Neil said, "I'm recognized by the fans as being with the Beatles. Before I could go out unnoticed to get the car, and the boys would just troop in. Now I have to keep in the background, and the new road manager, Mal Evans, goes out for the car. It all has to be planned like a military operation." After the show, while Mal and the Beatles celebrated with friends and relations at the Grosvenor House Hotel, a melee broke out outside the Palladium as the crowd, numbering thousands, spilled into the streets. Screaming girls launched themselves against the police, sending helmets flying and constables reeling, the Daily Herald reported. The Beatles' adulation was real. A national television audience of 15 million viewers had seen the Beatles that night. The next morning, the band dominated the London headlines, with the Daily Mirror trumpeting Beatlemania. It was on newsstands across the country. In retrospect, Mal considered the Palladium his first big engagement with the Beatles. His efforts in support of the boys' four-song set had come off without a hitch. Even so, the Palladium show was merely a taste of the hysteria that was to follow the Beatles in the coming years. I will end the video here. So Mal entered the whirlwind when he began his full-time job as road manager. He was so happy to be traveling around with the Beatles, and as he wrote, he felt like a free man. That got him into trouble with his wife. He was gone for 2 weeks when he first began his job, and he didn't phone or write his wife, which was terrible. His wife, Lily, made her dislike unknown because when he returned home, she left the house with her son for most of the time that he was there. That taught him to be more thoughtful, and he started to write her and phone her when he was gone. He had a horrible time in the beginning of his job, and he felt like he was going to be fired. He had the most trouble with Ringo's drum kit, and finally, after a while, he learned to do it within 2 minutes. Mal quit his reserve job. He no longer had the enthusiasm for it. Neil started to handle the Beatles and their business, and Mal handled the equipment and driving the Beatles to where they needed to go. He loved being alone driving. Mal also saw firsthand when Beatlemania started to happen, and it was quite an experience. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you haven't subscribed, if you could do so, it would help the channel to grow, as well as giving it a thumbs up. It's all a great help. And if you haven't clicked on the notification bell, if you could do that, it lets you know when a video is posted. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of the Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.